Cherry picking, the fault. Highly selected evidence is presented in order to persuade the audience to accept a position, while any evidence that would go against the position is withheld. An example is, our research shows that 100 cancer sufferers who used our new drug had remission. So it's established that our drug can cure cancer. This ignores, however, the fact that thousands of subjects saw no positive effects whatsoever. Our candidate gives 10% of his income to the needy, goes to church every Sunday, and volunteers 1 day a week at a homeless shelter. Therefore, he's honest and morally straight. But what they left out was that the same candidate gives 10% of his income to needy prostitutes in exchange for services, goes to the bar every Sunday after church, and only works at the homeless shelter to get new customers for his thriving drug dealing business. The logical form is evidence A and evidence B are available. Evidence A supports the claim of person X. Evidence B supports the counterclaim of person Y. Therefore, person X presents only evidence A. The mistake. Cherry picking involves suppressing evidence or providing incomplete evidence. It's the act of pointing to individual cases or data that seem to confirm a particular position while ignoring a significant portion of related and similar cases or data that contradict that position. An example in point was provided by Jonathan Streeter in September of 2018 regarding the excommunication of Sam Young. The published recording is isolated to that part of the hearing where the stake president lays out the evidence against Sam, evidence which is supposed to make the case that he's guilty of apostasy and should be excommunicated and cut off from the fellowship and participation of the church. On first listening, you may hear the quotes provided by the stake president and think that the case against Sam is fairly solid. However, if you actually chase down each of the quotes provided and look for where they may be obtained in their full context, you'll notice something, that the evidence is a patchwork of quotes taken out of context, with a sentence here and a few words there patched together to give the appearance of an apostate diatribe. It's the very definition of cherry picking, which is ironic because Mormons have long accused critics of unfairly taking quotes out of context and cherry-picking the words of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or other leaders in order to make them look bad. To have a stake president do this to someone like Sam Young is an embarrassing hypocrisy. If you take the time to go through each of the cited blog posts in context, you can see that in many instances the stake president skips over the parts of Sam's writings which refer to Mormon scripture and the doctrine of common consent, a foundational principle in church governance which requires members to voice their approval or disapproval of church leaders and decisions. He also conveniently skips over parts of Sam's writings in which he specifies that he's inviting people to participate in the principle of common consent to vote in disapproval if and only if they believe that it's the right thing for them to do. He's not telling people to be opposed to the leaders for the sake of opposing the church alone, as the stake president would have you believe. Unsurprisingly, the stake president skips right over instances where Sam speaks of his Christian conscience and how his actions are an appeal to follow the example of Christ. The cherry-picking technique is a favorite of the church and its apologists. You can hardly pick up a manual or read a conference report without finding examples of it. Here's one. Some things that are true are not edifying or appropriate to communicate. Readers of history and biography should ponder that moral reality as part of their effort to understand the significance of what they read. For example, in the recent Gospel Topics essay entitled Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham, in which the anonymous authors try to provide at least some credence to Smith's claims to having produced it through some means of translation. In an attempt to bolster their claims, they actually quote selectively from a document exposing Joseph as a liar, a thief, and a charlatan. And this is from Warren Parrish's letter to the editor, Painesville Republican, February the 15th, 1838. I have sat by his side and penned down the translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, as he claimed to receive it by direct inspiration of heaven. However, if you look at the full contents of Parrish's letter, you'll find that this one cherry-picked quote is in fact part of a long list of accusations of deception, fraud, and conspiracy, which he levels against Smith, that they have selectively edited out. In the very next paragraph, for example, Parrish goes on to say, "I've listened to him with feelings of no ordinary kind when he declared that the audible voice of God instructed him to establish a anti-banking institution, which, like Aaron's rod, should swallow up all others and grow and flourish and spread from the rivers to the end of the earth, and survive when all others should be laid in ruins. I've been astonished to hear him declare that we had $60,000 in specie in our vaults and $600,000 at our command, when he had not to exceed $6,000 and could not command any more." To use Parrish's quote in this manner, which is the opposite of that which he intended, is disgraceful, and yet is typical of the dishonesty found throughout the gospel topic essays. And it's the First Presidency, remember, that approves these essays. There are myriad examples of this type of cherry-picking and deceitfulness found throughout the gospel topic essays and other writings within the church. Here's just a few examples. The Mormon Church teaching its members for decades the story of Joseph Smith declining alcohol as a boy during his surgery to give the impression that he obeyed the word of wisdom during his life, while knowing that Joseph Smith both drank alcohol as an adult, including on the day that he was murdered, and supported alcohol production and sales in Nauvoo, including having a bar in his Nauvoo mansion. The Mormon Church knowingly deceiving members by portraying Joseph Smith as translating the Book of Mormon using a breastplate and the Urim and Thummim, when they knew full well that he used a stone in his hat. Joseph Smith knowing and intentionally altering revelations written down in both the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, once they were demonstrated to be false and untrue. Joseph Smith intentionally defrauding members of the church in Kirtland off their savings by knowingly creating a fraudulent bank and then misappropriating the funds, by hiding the real reason why Oliver Cowdery left the church, i.e. Smith excommunicating him for accurately accusing him of an adulterous affair with Fanny Alger in 1838. Joseph Smith overtly lying to Emma, his wife, about polygamy, which included Joseph performing a fake sealing of Emily and Eliza Partridge to Joseph after he had already been sealed to them just to fool Emma. The fact that Joseph Smith overtly lied to the LDS Church membership about his practice of polygamy. Joseph Smith publicly maligning women as whores who denied his polygamous advances. Joseph Smith destroying the Nauvoo Expositor because it again accurately reported that Smith was secretly practicing polygamy and lying about it. The Mormon Church is knowing and falsely portraying Joseph Smith as a monogamist in its curriculum for members for over a century. The Mormon Church telling the world in 1890 that it had stopped polygamy and then secretly and intentionally continued to practice it at the highest levels, including allowing new polygamous sealings for several more decades. The full membership of the Mormon Church being put on explicit notice in 1922 by B.H. Roberts and others that both the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham contain significant scientific problems, and then hiding this information from the membership for another almost 100 years, and seeking to suppress the memory of B.H. Roberts, including telling Truman Madsen not to publish his biography of B.H. Roberts in 1965 out of fear that it would challenge the faith of its members. Mormon Church historian and eventual prophet Joseph Fielding Smith, when encountering the 1832 version of Joseph Smith's first vision, which significantly contradicted the later 1838 official version, ripped it out of Joseph's journal and hid it in his safe for almost 3 decades until he was publicly exposed for having done so, and then taping it back into the journal. Mormon apostle Bruce R. McConkley publicly claiming in 1981 that the Adam God doctrine was never known to be taught in the church, only to acknowledge in private to Eugene England in the same year that of course it was. The Mormon Church referring to the lifting of the black priesthood ban as a policy change when the church knows that the black priesthood ban was declared to be doctrinal by the First Presidency in 1949. How do you respond to cherry picking? Well, there are 2 main ways to respond to the use of cherry-picking fallacy. 1, call out the fallacious reasoning. Specifically point out the fact that your opponent is ignoring crucial information which should be taken into account. and explain why this is a problem. Secondly, bring omitted information into consideration, as I'm trying to do here. Specifically discuss the information which was omitted and show how taking it into account changes the situation altogether. There are two main ways to respond to the use of cherry picking. One is call out the fallacious reasoning. Specifically point out the fact that your opponent is ignoring crucial information which should be taken into account, and explain why this is a problem. Secondly, bring omitted information into consideration. Specifically discuss the information which was omitted and show how taking it into account changes the situation at hand. Special pleading is an informal fallacy wherein one cites something as an exception to a general or universal principle without justifying the special exception. It's an argument in which the speaker deliberately ignores aspects that are unfavorable to their point of view. The fault in this fallacy is we are applying rules and standards to others and their circumstances, but exempting ourselves from the same criteria without providing adequate justification. If we agree with a general rule, then we have to agree to it in every case. It's contradictory to accept the law in general and yet refuse to apply it in our own particular case. Some examples are, yes, I do think, Your Honor, that drunk drivers should go to jail. But he's my son. He's a good boy. He comes from a good home. He just made a mistake. Or, yes, teacher, I believe that lying is wrong, but my daughter is normally such a good kid. Or, everyone should be patient and wait their turn in line. However, I need to go to the front of the line because I'm somewhere I've got to get to. Special pleading is often a result of strong emotional beliefs that interfere with reason. Special pleading is, again, having standards that apply to others but not oneself, without applying justification for the exemption. Yes, Doctrine and Covenants 131 does say that the Lord will not look upon sin with the least degree of allowance, but Heavenly Father loves me, so I'm sure that I'll be eligible for exaltation. Even though the LDS scripture insists that no sin will be accepted to God, those using this argument feel that they are somehow exempt from any penalty for their sin. An early example of special pleading in the church was evidenced at the May 25, 1842 Nauvoo High Council investigation of several individuals, including John C. Bennett and William Smith, the prophet's brother, for licentiousness, adultery, and many other sins. Before the time set for trial, however, Emma Smith talked to Joseph and said that the charge preferred against William was with a view to injuring the Smith family. After the trial had begun, Joseph entered the room and was given a seat. The testimony of the witnesses concerning his brother's sins was then continued. In a short time, however, Joseph arose, filled with wrath, and said, "Brother Brigham, I will not listen to this abuse of my family a minute longer. I will wade through blood up to my knees before I do so." The charges were then dropped against William. The mistake in special pleading is that if you agree with the general law, then you have to agree with it in all cases. The comeback, you need to impress on your opponent the virtue of consistency. Mormons are a master of this special pleading fallacy. For example, when Catholics meet in councils to establish church doctrine, it's not the Lord's way. When the Q15 meet in councils to hammer out church doctrine, this is the Lord's way. You see, with the Q15, they're listening to the Spirit, and it confirms what they are discussing. But with Catholicism, they're just speaking as men. Yes, I believe in freedom of the press and respect for personal property, but the Nauvoo expositor needed to be destroyed for publishing stories of Joseph Smith's polygamy and his finances. Yes, we expect you to confess and repent, but give Joseph a break. He was just a man. Not surprisingly, there's always been a lack of uniformity when it comes to church discipline. One of the best known examples might be when gay LDS church patriarch Joseph F. Smith, who had several homosexual affairs while in office and was released due to illness when his grandfather and church president Herbert J. Grant died. Would a regular Marty Mormon be treated with such consideration? How was the fraudster and liar Paul H. Dunn disciplined? How many temple interviews did he answer yes to when asked, "Are you honest in your dealings?" Dunn, too, was moved to emeritus status due to illness. The church certainly has one set of rules for its friends and another set of rules for the rank and file members. Sterling Gray Van Wagenen, 71, a prominent Mormon filmmaker, pled guilty to 2 counts of aggravated sexual abuse of a child, a first-degree felony, in 2019. The first incident occurred back in 1993 when David, a 13-year-old boy, was enjoying a sleepover at his friend's house when he was awoken in the middle of the night to find his friend's father, Sterling, a prominent Latter-day Saint and co-founder of the Sundance Film Festival, with his hand down his pants, stroking his penis. The boy told his parents, who immediately reported the assault to their Mormon bishop. The bishop did not report the sexual assault to the police, and while it was revealed that even though the abuse was reported to LDS church authorities, Sterling was not excommunicated. Indeed, he was subsequently hired to work as a professor at the church's owned Brigham Young University. He also went on to produce numerous LDS church films, including the film used during the temple ceremony. Contrast this with the excommunication of Sam Young, who tried to stop inappropriate sexual invasive questioning at worthiness interviews by psychologically untrained Mormon bishops. The straw man fallacy sets up a weakened or caricaturized version of the opponent's argument. The speaker then proceeds to demolish the weak version of the argument and claim victory. The Mormon Church often claims to be the victim of the straw man fallacy, and I'm quoting, "This is one of the most common anti-Mormon approaches. Rarely do anti-Mormon authors fairly convey LDS opinion and thought on a target, and even more rarely do such authors engage LDS scholarship. Most anti-Mormon arguments are decades old and have been asked and answered many times. Thanks to the straw man tactic, anti-Mormons will continue to recycle their attacks." The fault with the straw man fallacy, an intentionally misrepresented proposition that is set up because it's easier to defeat than the opponent's real argument. By exaggerating, misrepresenting, or just completely fabricating someone's argument, it's much easier to present your own position as being reasonable. The logical form is person A makes claim Y. Person 2 restates person 1's claim in a distorted way. Person 2 attacks the distorted version of the claim, therefore Y is false. Prophets are imperfect, a straw man fallacy. Mormon belief teaches that prophets are imperfect. This is perfectly reasonable. I've never heard anyone teach that prophets are infallible. Human frailties and weaknesses are not the problem, however. The problem is much larger. The real issue is deception and their role as prophet and the falsehoods they teach as doctrines from God. If prophets can and have taught serious false doctrines, then they are not a reliable source for truth. If they create false doctrines by teaching their own philosophies mingled with Scripture, then they're not true prophets. Were blacks less valiant in their pre-mortal existence? The church now denies this belief, but it was taught as doctrine for decades. White Americans, especially those born in the covenant, were told that they were pre-mortal superstars. Were people born with disabilities or born into extreme poverty or oppression less valiant in the pre-existence? Well, Harold Lee taught that they were. Did God punish the descendants of Cain for millennia and even deny them the opportunity to be sealed in the temple? Did God teach prophets to be racist? Brigham Young taught God was the source of racism and that this was really his justice. Did God then rescind this punishment after thousands of years, just as it appeared that racism would no longer be tolerated in the United States? Do we believe that polygamy is required for exaltation? Was it truly commanded of God, as Brigham Young certainly taught? Yet when Gordon Hinckley was publicly asked about polygamy, he stated, "I condemn it, yes, as a practice, because I think it's not doctrine." At least one of them is not being honest here. Who's right? Who's wrong? Was Joseph Smith just imperfect when he secretly married the wives of men that he sent on missions? Or was he a wolf in sheep's clothing amongst his unprotected sheep? Was it just normal human weakness when he coerced a 14-year-old girl into marrying him in secret? Is it extraordinarily evil to blame God for such immoral behavior? Are temple ceremonies revealed by God or copied from the Masons? Is Adam God, or is Adam our God, as Brigham Young mistakenly told us? Is blood atonement a true doctrine? Do Mormon prophets have the gift of discernment? Or is this a dishonest claim of power? Mark Hoffman seemed to have their number. If prophets could be wrong about issues as important as murder, adultery, or coerced marriages to children, how do we know that they're not just teaching their own philosophies about today's issues? If polygamy was not forced on Joseph Smith by God and an angel with a drawn sword, then Smith is not only fallible, he's a sexual predator. Are these actions of example? Jack, I believe that biological evolution is both a theory and a fact. Ben, that's ridiculous. How could you possibly be so absolutely certain that we evolved from pond scum? Jack, actually that's a gross misrepresentation of my belief. I never claimed that we evolved from pond scum. Science is based on empirical evidence, and therefore a scientific fact is something that is confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional consent. The empirical evidence for the fact that biological evolution does occur falls into this category. The straw man fallacy is making a particular position look weak by misrepresenting the argument. According to the History of the Church, Volume 6, Joseph Smith said the following: "Many men say that there is one God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, are all one God. I say this is a strange God anyhow. 3 in 1 or 1 in 3. It's a curious organization. All are to be crammed into one God according to secularism. It would make the biggest God in all the world. He would be a wonderfully big God. He would be a giant or a monster." The analysis here is that Joseph Smith gives an inaccurate analysis of what the Trinity teaches, making it easy to dismiss a God as described here. This version is certainly not an argument anyone would want to believe or defend. In the if by whiskey fallacy, the response to a question appears to support both sides of an issue, a tactic common in politics. It's avoiding answering a question on a controversial matter in a clear and decisive way, a classic example of doublespeak. This fallacy panders to an audience. It argues both sides of the question and will therefore appear to support whichever position the listener has.
My friends, I had not intended to discuss this controversial issue at this particular time. However, I want you to know that I do not shun controversy. On the contrary, I will take a stand on any issue at any time, regardless of how fraught with controversy it might be. You have asked me how I feel about whiskey. All right, here's how I feel about whiskey. If, when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison scourge, the bloody monster that defiles innocence, dethrones reason, destroys homes, creates misery and poverty, yea, literally takes the bread from the mouths of little children. If you mean the evil drink that topples Christian man and woman from the pinnacle of righteous, gracious living into the bottomless pit of degradation and despair and shame and helplessness and hopelessness, then I certainly am against it. But if when you say whiskey, you mean the oil of conversation, the philosophic wine, the ale that is consumed when good fellows get together, that puts a song in their hearts and laughter on their lips and the warm glow of contentment in their eyes, if you mean Christmas cheer, if you mean that stimulating drink that puts a spring in the old gentleman's step on a frosty, crispy morning, if you mean that drink which enables a man to magnify his joy and happiness and to forget, if only for a little while, all of life's great tragedies and heartaches and sorrows, if you mean that drink, the sale of which pours into our treasuries untold millions of dollars, which are used to provide tender care for our little crippled children, our blind, our deaf, our dumb, our pitiful aged and infirm, to build highways and hospitals and schools, then certainly I am for it. This is my stand. I will not retreat from it, and I will not compromise.
It's the logical form. If you mean X, then one-sided loaded language rant supporting side A. If you mean Y, then one-sided loaded language rant supporting side B. People have often asked me, for example, if I favor freedom of religion. If you mean freedom to practice my faith according to my conscience, of course I do. If you mean freedom for the fundamentalist Mormons to support their deceptive leader Warren Jeffs, then of course not. He should be put down. The statement tries to have it both ways, or be all things to all people. It hopes that Mormons will hear the idea that they should be free to practice their own faith and religion. It also hopes that those who oppose Warren Jeffs and the FLDS will hear the statement that they should not be tolerated.
If we Republicans choose Donald Trump as our nominee, the prospects for a safe and prosperous future are greatly diminished.
Being in Donald Trump's magnificent hotel and having his endorsement is a delight.
If Donald Trump's plans were ever implemented, the country would sink into prolonged recession.
Donald Trump has shown an extraordinary ability to understand how our economy works, to create jobs for the American people.
So even though Donald Trump has offered very few specific economic plans, what little he has said is enough to know that he would be very bad for American workers and for American families.
He understands that our economy is facing threats from abroad. He's one of the few people who stood up and said, you know what, China has been cheating. They've taken jobs from Americans. They haven't played fair. We have to have a president who will stand up to cheaters. We believe in free trade and free enterprise, but we don't believe in allowing people to cheat day in and day out.
But you say, wait. Isn't he a huge business success? Doesn't he know what he's talking about? No, he isn't. And no, he doesn't.
I spent my life in the private sector, not quite as successful as this guy.
Moving the goalposts, the fault, demanding from an opponent that he or she addresses more and more points after the initial counter-argument has been satisfied. It's refusing to concede or accept the opponent's argument. An example is, Bob, bloodletting works. Show me one study that proves otherwise. Mary, okay, here's a double-blind, placebo-controlled study showing that it doesn't work. Bob, okay, but that's just one study. That doesn't prove anything. The form is, issue A has been raised and adequately answered. Issue B then is raised and is also adequately answered. Then issue C is raised, and so on and so on. One of the striking examples of changing the goalposts is illustrated by the church's one-word change in the introduction to the Book of Mormon, which now reads, after thousands of years, all were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. It used to say, were the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Why was this change made? It was made in 2006 and not 1960 or 1930 or 1832, because in the last few decades, research and technology into DNA has reached a critical mass. The science is now well understood and has progressed to the point where even the boys down at Fair Mormon and those geneticists at BYU could no longer ignore or deny it. Another example is the translation of the Egyptian papyri that Joseph Smith said was written by the hand of Abraham. After Smith's death, the papyri changed hands a number of times and ended up in Chicago, where it was thought to have been lost in the Great Fire. However, they were later discovered in New York, where, to the LDS Church's dismay, Egyptologists unanimously determined that these papyri were nothing more than a common funerary text. How did the church respond? When scientific dating put the papyri at 60 AD, long after Abraham's day, the apologists proposed that it was a copy of a copy, or alternatively, that the real papyri was not the one that they had, or at least was just a portion of the one that Joseph had used, and the real papyri was lost. This, however, is inconsistent with Smith's grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, which clearly shows his extraction of the characters from the same papyri. Now the goalposts have been moved even further back by the church apologists, suggesting now that the papyri was just a catalyst to a revelation that Smith must have received regarding the Book of Abraham. The cattle fallacy is all about contradiction. It's about moving from one alternative to the next if and when it's clear that the former alternative no longer works. And it often involves lying. The history of Mormonism is ripe with examples of moving quickly from one doctrinal belief to the next, or one explanation to the next, when the evidence against the former becomes so convincing that none but the fully indoctrinated would buy it. A couple of examples are the Lamanites, which went from the principal ancestors of the American Indians to among those ancestors. The view of those with black skin from the seed of Cain and an inferior race to all are equal in God's eyes, declared by Russell Nelson. The Book of Abraham went from a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt. The writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, written by his own hand upon papyrus. To the papyrus acted as a catalyst, a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith a revelation about the life of Abraham, even if the revelation did not directly correlate to the characters in the papyrus. There is a pattern in the way that the Mormon Church approaches embarrassing issues in their past. It's their modus operandi, the formula being deny that the controversial or unsavory thing ever happened in the first place, or, secondly, acknowledge the thing, but deny its relevance of any kind and indicate that it's no big deal. Or, when that doesn't work, acknowledge its relevance, but say it's just old news and it's been around forever. When rumors of Smith's rock in the hat story started to make the rounds, we witnessed first the denial. In 2000, Joseph Fielding McConkie, son of Bruce R. McConkie, and Craig J. Osler, both employed by BYU, wrote an essay titled The Process of Translating the Book of Mormon, in which they wrote, "Thus, everything we have in the Book of Mormon, according to Mr. Whitmer, was translated by placing the chocolate-colored stone in a hat into which Joseph would bury his head so as to close out the light. While doing so, he could see an oblong piece of parchment on which the hieroglyphics would appear, and below the ancient writings, the translation would be given in English. Joseph would then read it to his scribe Oliver Cowdery, who in turn would write it down. If he did so correctly, the characters and the interpretation would disappear and be replaced by another character and its interpretation. The testimony of David Whitmer simply does not accord with the divine pattern. If Joseph Smith translated everything that is now in the Book of Mormon without using the gold plates, we are left to wonder why the plates were necessary in the first place. It will be remembered that possession of the plates placed the Smith family in considerable danger, causing them a host of difficulties. If the plates were not part of the translation process, this would not have been the case. It also leaves us wondering why the Lord directs the writers of the Book of Mormon to take a duplicate record of the plates. And then comes the gaslighting. Acknowledge its relevance, but say it's just old news and it's been around forever. The stone is mentioned occasionally in church publications, but rarely, if ever, discussed in the 21st century in venues such as Sunday school, nor is it portrayed in any church-related artwork. This is a conflation of the Nephite interpreters and the seer stone under the name Urim and Thummim. In church, we discuss the Urim and Thummim with the assumption that it is always the instrument that Joseph recovered with the plates. Only those familiar with the sources will realize that there was more than one translation instrument. That said, the church has been very frank about the seer stone use. Through the product of the translation of the Book of Mormon is usually given much more attention than the process. Again, it was mentioned in the Children's Friend once. The cattle fallacy is the closest out-and-out lying, and sadly has been and continues to be used by the leadership of the Mormon Church. Let me read you the Mormon narcissist prayer. That didn't happen, and if it did, it wasn't that bad, and if it was, it's no big deal, and if it is, it's not my fault, and if it was, I didn't mean it, and if I did, you deserved it. The no true Scotsman fallacy defines a term in such a way as to favor the speaker and disfavor his or her opponent. It's a form of begging the question, since one shapes a definition used in the argument to support the conclusion one wishes to reach. An example, an argument, Latter-day Saints are not Christian because they don't believe in the Trinity. Mormon rebuttal, Christians are not defined as those who accept the Trinity, but rather as those who accept Jesus as Son of God and the Savior of the world. Since the LDS do accept this, they're Christians, just not Trinitarian Christians. In other words, Trinitarian does not equal Christian. The fault. When a universal all, every, etc. claim is refuted, the opponent does not concede the point or make an attempt to revise the claim. They're simply going from the general to specific and failing to give any objective criteria for doing so. An example, no good Mormon can be a Democrat. Well, Harry Reid is a Democrat. Well, Harry Reid is no good Mormon. Another example, anybody who has a testimony of the gospel and is converted will never leave the church. Well, Bishop Lee Baker bore his testimony every Sunday for 5 years and he left the church. Well, it wasn't a real testimony and he wasn't really converted and he wasn't a true Mormon. Or, callings are inspired by God. Why then did God call a mission president that molested young missionaries? Well, he wasn't a true Mormon, let alone a true mission president. Anyway, calling or not, people have their free agency. The logical form is all X are Y, refuted that all X are not Y, then all true X are Y.
No true Latter-day Saint will ever take a stand that is in opposition to what the Lord has revealed to those who direct the affairs of his earthly kingdom. No Latter-day Saint who is true and faithful in all things will ever pursue a course or espouse a cause or publish an article or book that weakens or destroys faith.
Elder Jeffrey Holland uses this technique when he says, if anyone is foolish enough or misled enough to reject 531 pages of a heretofore unknown text, teeming with literary and Semitic complexity without honestly attempting to account for the origin of those pages, if that is the case, then such a person, elect or otherwise, has been deceived, and if he or she leaves the church, it must be done by crawling over or under or around the Book of Mormon to make that exit. Here's Ezra Taft Benson. No true Latter-day Saint can be a communist or a socialist because communist principles run counter to the revealed Word of God and to the Constitution of this land, which was established by men whom the God of heaven raised up unto that very purpose. Here's Heber J. Grant. There is no true Latter-day Saint who would not rather bury a son or a daughter than to have him or her lose his or her chastity, realizing that it's chastity that's of more value than anything else in this world. Just look at that countenance. Doesn't that exude love? Denying Occam's razor. Occam's razor, or sometimes the law of parsimony, is a philosophical problem-solving principle first attributed to William of Occam, 1287 to 1347, an English Franciscan friar and scholastic philosopher. His law can be interpreted as, from among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. It is the most likely to be true, at least the most correct, until proven otherwise. The fault here is denying a cause when the circumstances indicate that it's highly probable. An example that medical students still, I think, learn is when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Here's an example. John, I believe that Joseph Smith, a 14-year-old farm boy, prayed to know which of all the churches is true. In response, both God and the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him. Occam, is it more likely that God the Father and his Son appeared to young Joseph Smith, or is it more likely that Joseph Smith made it all up? Why should we believe Smith, but not any of the other people who claimed the same great visions, even in his day and in upstate New York? Because of the power of his particular testimony? How do we know testimonies aren't simply emotional self-delusion? After all, it's the con man who says, just trust me, without evidence. We can apply Occam's razor to so many of the claims of Mormonism. For example, with regard to what is the more likely explanation of each of the following set of issues. Please note, I've taken each of these statements from the Church's primary apologetic site, Fair Mormon. Which of the two statements is most likely if we apply Occam's razor? On the issue of the absence of any archaeological anthropological, or linguistic evidence supporting the Book of Mormon, Fair Mormon says, it is entirely possible for a religion, especially an aniconic religion, that is, a religion without images, to simply disappear from the archaeological record. Or, Occam's response, the dearth of any physical evidence of the Book of Mormon shows that it's a piece of 19th century fiction. How about this one? DNA evidence shows conclusively that the Aboriginal peoples of North and South America are of Asian, not Middle Eastern origin. Fair Mormon says, the Book of Mormon is not a volume about the history and origins of all American Indians. A careful reading of the text clearly indicates that the people described in the Book of Mormon were limited in the recording of their history to events that had religious relevance and occurred in relatively close proximity to the keepers of the annals. Or, no Middle Eastern DNA is found in Aboriginal peoples of the Americas, which would support the Book of Mormon's claim that the native peoples of America descended from Middle Eastern immigrants, because the Book of Mormon narrative is bogus. Number 3. Why is it that the Book of Mormon contains so many anachronisms? Fair Mormon says, the Book of Mormon does not state that the Jaredites brought horses, swine, sheep, cattle, or asses with them. Also, when they talk about horses, they may have meant tabors, and the silk spoken of may have been henequen, which is very much like linen. Or, because it was written by an individual or individuals ignorant of the true origins of North American plants and animals, metallurgy, and the use of the wheel, etc. Number 4. Why is it that the Book of Mormon contains so many passages taken from the King James Version of the Bible, including errors found in the 1769 edition, which Joseph Smith possessed? Fair Mormon says, we don't know the specific mechanism by which the biblical passages were included in the translation. Therefore, we cannot answer this question. The only description of the translation process that Joseph Smith ever gave was that it was performed by the gift and power of God, or, as evidenced by the presence of errors unique to the 1769 KJV of the Bible, which Smith owned, he or his scribe simply copied the passages from it. Number 5. Why did Joseph Smith marry and have sex with up to 40 women, including girls as young as 14 years of age? Fair Mormon says, Joseph Smith's polygamous marriages to young women may be difficult to understand or explain today, but in his own time, such age differences were not typically an obstacle to marriage. Plus, how do we know that he had sex with them? Or, Smith had a healthy libido, and like many other cult leaders, used his power and position to satisfy his sexual appetite. A 37-year-old man marrying a 14-year-old girl was shocking, even by 19th century standards, and extremely rare. Number 6, why is it that the signs and tokens found in the Mormon temple ceremonies are virtually identical to those in Freemasonry? Again, Fair Mormon says the endowment did not simply imitate the rituals of Freemasonry. Rather, Joseph's encounter with Masonry served as a catalyst for his revelation. As well, Masonry goes back to the time of Solomon, so they both share a common source. Or, Joseph Smith, being a master Mason, simply appropriated them from Masonry, an organization which has its roots in Europe in the Middle Ages, not in Old Testament times. Number 7, why are there several different iterations of the first vision, and why were none of them reported until years after they allegedly occurred? Fair Mormon says Joseph Smith just emphasized different aspects of his visions in his various accounts. Occam would say the various and 9 different versions of the first vision, and the fact that no one, including his family, heard anything about this seminal event until 12 years at a minimum after it supposedly took place, cast considerable doubt on whether it ever actually happened. Number 8, why is it that all non-Mormon archaeologists indicate Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham translation is absolute nonsense? Fair Mormon says, at the present time, we simply don't know the exact nature and the relationship that existed between the Book of Abraham and the papyrus that Joseph Smith possessed. We do know that the prophet Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham by the gift and power of God, or Joseph Smith pretended to translate the because at that time no one knew how to translate ancient Egyptian to English, and he could say virtually anything with immunity. Number 9, why is it that blacks were victims of racism for much of the Mormon Church's history? Fair Mormon says that prophets are not perfect and don't claim to be, nor do they always act as prophets in what they say and do. I guess most white people in America have grown up with some form of racism. Mormons also have their share. Or Joseph Smith and many of his successors were racist. But why, if they were prophets, would the Lord not teach them to love all of his children? And finally, number 10, why is it that Joseph Smith, a self-proclaimed prophet of God, was charged with numerous criminal offenses, including bank fraud, perjury, conspiracy to murder, and treason? Fair Mormon says that Joseph Smith believed that his enemies perverted the legal process, using them as tools of religious persecution against him, as they had been used against many of Christ's apostles and other past martyrs. Or Joseph Smith was a convicted con man and continued his dishonest and often criminal behavior throughout his entire life. Remember, when applying Occam's razor to an array of issues as we've just done, the results are cumulative and could be stated as, what is the best explanation for why the preponderance of the above set of issues indicate Mormonism's claims are false? 1. All of the issues have been misjudged and misinterpreted, or Mormonism and its claims and assertions are false. It's analogous to, what are the odds of flipping a coin 10 times in a row and having it come up heads each time? Well, as this simple calculation shows, the odds of the coin coming up heads 10 times in a row are 1 in 1,024. 10 heads from 10 tosses is highly unlikely, but importantly, it's not impossible. The odds are simply 1 in 1,024. Just don't bet on it happening. The odds of all of the explanations that the apologists at Fair Mormon have created, overcoming the more rational and logically obvious explanations suggested by Occam's razor, are also 1 in 1,024. Argumentum ad ignorantium. This fallacy occurs when you argue that your conclusion must be true because there's no evidence against it. This fallacy wrongly shifts the burden of proof away from the one making the claim. An example is, God must exist, since there's no one who can demonstrate that she doesn't. Or, the doctors can't explain how she woke up from her coma, so it must have been by the power of our prayers. Or, why are you so skeptical of the first vision? Can you prove that it never happened? People can use this fallacy to manipulate others because there's often an appeal to a person's emotions contained within the proposed idea. The assertion then puts non-believers in the fallacy on the defensive, which is irrational, as the person proposing the idea should have the burden of proof. And finally, in a shocking display of ignorance of both logic and philosophy, Fair Mormon moves next to that old chestnut, the absence of evidence does not equal the evidence of absence. I've heard this so many times from wide-eyed young Latter-day Saint missionaries. However, while cute, this little maxim altogether negates the importance of evidence with a negative value. A null result is equivalent to evidence of absence and can be used to deduce or infer the non-existence or non-presence of something. If, for example, a physician during exploratory surgery does not find a malignant tumor or any malignant cells within the patient, this represents a null result, that is, finding nothing, and is evidence of the absence of cancer, even though the surgeon did not detect anything per se. Such inductive reasoning is essential in the world of science and to a thinking person's understanding of reality. The burden of proof. This fallacy attempts to shift the burden of proof from the person making the claim to those questioning it. The burden of proof always lies with someone who is making a claim, and is not upon anyone else to disprove. The inability or disinclination to disprove a claim does not render the claim valid, nor give it any credence whatsoever. However, it's important to note that we can never be certain of anything, and so we must assign value to any claim based on the available evidence, and to dismiss something on the basis that it hasn't been proven beyond any doubt is also fallacious reasoning. An example, Bertrand Russell declared that there's a teapot at this very moment orbiting the sun between the Earth and Mars, and that because no one can prove him wrong, the claim must therefore be valid. The burden of proof properly rests on the claimant. The person who is making the claim has to back it up. It's not the responsibility of others to prove that the claim is not true. The argument that the Book of Mormon is true, unless you can prove otherwise, is faulty reasoning. The person who claims that the Book of Mormon is true must prove it. This is a variation of the legal principle that one is innocent until proven guilty. If the Book of Mormon is true, then it's up to the members of the church, regardless of how hard it is, to prove that it is in fact true. The view of faith in Mormon scripture differs from that found in the Bible. In Alma 34:17 we read, "Yea, there are many who do say, If thou wilt show unto us a sign from heaven, then we shall know for a surety, then we shall believe. Now I ask, is this faith? Behold, I say unto you, Nay. For if a man knoweth a thing, he hath no cause to believe, for he knoweth it." In other words, faith involves believing something that we don't know. If we knew it, there'd be no need for faith. But the Bible proposes a different relationship between faith and reason. Knowledge is not the opposite of belief, as in the Mormon scriptures. Rather, the Bible presents a view of faith that is based upon what we do know. Jesus healed the paralytic so that the people would know that he has the authority of God. As Professor J.P. Moreland often said, faith involves trusting what we have reason to believe is true. The reason the Book of Mormon has this view of faith and knowledge is that Mormon claims cannot be investigated. None of the cities mentioned in the Book of Mormon have been located, Zarahemla, etc. The gold plates can't be examined. None of the Book of Mormon historical sites exist or can be excavated, in the same way that myriad biblical sites can be excavated and discovered. When there's no convincing external evidence collaborating in belief, it must be based solely upon feelings and blind faith. The view of faith in the Book of Mormon is decidedly not the biblical view. See John 20:30-31. I miss the raconteur and intellectual Christopher Hitchens, but he left us with an epistemological razor that states that the burden of proof regarding the truthfulness of a claim lies with the one who makes the claim. If this burden is not met, then the claim is unfounded. As Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Of all the logical fallacies, amphiboly is the most fun, and maybe a good one for us to end on here today. It's from the Greek, irregular speech, and it's pronounced amphiboly. One of the common fallacies in Western philosophy is called amphiboly. More formally speaking, the fallacy of the amphiboly occurs when the meaning of a phrase or sentence is indeterminate or ambiguous, particularly as a result of poor syntax, and especially when further inferences are drawn based on the acceptance of an unintended meaning of the passage. Amphiboly is usually so recognizable that it's rarely used in real-life situations to make a claim seem stronger than it really is. Instead, it more often leads to humorous misunderstandings and confusions. The logical form is, claim X is made. Y is concluded based on an ambiguous understanding of X. Groucho Marx said about his trip to Africa, "Last night I shot a lion in my pajamas. How he got into them, I'll never know." The inadvertent wordplay can result in outrageous misunderstandings, but they tickle our sense of humor. Teachers strike idle kids. Lawyers give poor legal advice. Prostitutes appeal to Pope. Dr. Ruth to talk about sex with newspaper editors. Burglar gets 9 months in violin case. Marijuana issues sent to joint committee. Juvenile court to try shooting defendant. Autos kill 110 people a day. Let's resolve to do better. A few more examples. Don't let worry kill you. Let the church help. 8 new choir robes are currently needed due to the addition of several new members and to the deterioration of some old ones. For those of you who have children and don't know it, we have a nursery next to the Relief Society room. Sister Smith remains in hospital and needs blood donors for more transfusions. She's also having trouble sleeping and requests tapes of President Nelson's talks. On Thursday evening, there'll be a meeting of the Little Mothers Club. All members wishing to become little mothers should meet with the bishop after sacrament. Brother White will deliver his last talk as stake president, after which the choir will sing, "Now Let Us Rejoice." Sometimes it's just misspelling. Please excuse Jeff from seminary this week. He has a cold and can't breathe well. Or sorry, Sister Jarvis, Helen won't be able to make the temple trip today. She's in bed with Gramps.
Well, we've come to the end of our journey together through critical thinking and logical fallacies. I've hopefully left you with a better understanding of what critical thinking is and how it can help us more intelligently and less emotionally evaluate the arguments made by others with the intent to convince and at times to manipulate us. The focus has been, of course, to discuss rational thinking in the context of the claims made by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the pronouncements made by her leaders, apologists, and other functionaries. As well, we've spent half our time together discussing a good many of the logical fallacies included in my book, Critical Thinking for Mormons, often found in Mormonism. If you viewed the entire 6 hours, let me congratulate you on your grit. The content of this broadcast often demands focus and concentration, and it's not always intuitive. I haven't pulled any punches, which can be upsetting to true believing Mormons who revere and often worship many of their leaders. However, all of the utterances herein contained have been researched and well cited. I've tried not to be snarky when discussing certain Mormon prophets and apostles, but admit that I found it difficult in the face of the river of racism, misogyny, and homophobia that seems to animate them. I find it beyond irresponsible for them to mouth unqualified statements that have contributed to the suicide of many sweet and confused young people. Nevertheless, I've tried to direct my focus to the irrational, sloppy thinking and manipulative tactics employed at times by the Church, her leaders, and apologists in their attempt to support their theories and often changing doctrines. If you've thoughtfully considered what I've presented here and remain a stalwart and committed member, then the exercise has been worthwhile because it simply strengthened your belief. If you're an apologist for the Church, then I've provided you at least with a good deal of fodder. If, on the other hand, it has created a disturbance in your force, I would suggest you re-examine the historicity of the Church, as well as the claims made by its founder, Joseph Smith, from the perspective now of a critical thinker. As I said at the beginning of this journey, this is not a zero-sum game. It's not, nor has it ever been, Mormonism or nothing. Please don't make the mistake of throwing out the Christ child with the Mormon bathwater. In either case, I want to thank you for viewing and wish you nothing but peace and happiness in the future.
And let me leave you with my 10 commandments of critical thinking. Number 1, thou shalt not attack the person or character, but rather the argument ad hominem. Number 2, thou shalt not reduce the argument to two possibilities when other possibilities are present. False dilemma. Number 3, thou shalt not assume that something is true solely because someone in authority says so. Appeal to authority. Number 4, thou shalt not believe that because one event follows another, it was caused or analogous to it. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Number 5, thou shalt not conclude that because you can't believe something or refuse to, that it's not true. Argument from incredulity. Number 6, thou shalt not form an analogy to prove or disprove an argument where the analogy is too dissimilar to the argument. False analogy. Number 7, thou shalt not derail an argument by bringing into consideration irrelevant or out of context information. Red herring fallacy. Number 8, thou shalt not favor information that confirms only your existing beliefs or hypotheses. Confirmation bias. Number 9, thou shalt not suppress evidence or provide incomplete evidence so as to confirm your particular position. Cherry picking. And number 10, thou shalt not set up a weakened or caricatured version of your opponent's argument so you might demolish it. Strawman fallacy.